next speaker is a good friend of mine, Josh Goldfarb. He's the VP and CTO of FireEye. Josh is an experienced information security analyst with over a decade of experience building, operating, and running security operations centers. Josh currently serves as VP CTO Emerging Technologies at FireEye. He has consulted and advised numerous clients in both the public and private sector at strategic and tactical level. In addition to Josh blogging and public speaking appearances, he is also a regular contributor to Dark Reading, Security Week, and business journals. Josh, the stage is yours.
تفاجأت إسرائيل ومعها العالم بقيام آلاف الهاكرز أو قراصنة الإنترنت.
Hackers gaining access to confidential.
Hackervorwürfe gegen WikiLeaks-Gründer Julian Assange.
Actress Jennifer Lawrence was among several stars.
Cyber Week 2016 presents Terror, Espionage, and Crime.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I'm very excited for today's panel, this afternoon's panel. We've talked about so many interesting topics around various different areas and specialties within security, cybersecurity, information security, and a number of other types of topics. What makes me particularly interested in the upcoming panel is that what I think this panel will help us address and understand is the question of why. I'm someone who likes to ask questions. I always ask a lot of questions. People ask me, why do you always answer a question with a question? And I say, why not, right? But I think in this panel, we'll examine the question of why. Why do attackers do what they do? What are they after? What are some of the things they take from organizations? What are some of the techniques they use, et cetera? And I think this is a very important lesson in security as we begin to move forward and mature as a community. The security space, we tend to think a lot about things like malware and hacking and all types of different specific tools and techniques that attackers might use, but sometimes the why gets lost in all of it. And when we sort of zoom out and think about security as a risk mitigation or a risk management profession, we begin to understand that, yes, we can compromise a laptop or a mobile device, we can knock over a web server, we can do any number of things, but those are a foothold, those are a landing point inside an organization, whatever type of organization it happens to be, that allow us to execute our actions on objectives. In other words, what are we after? What are the attackers after when they do compromise a laptop or a server or some type of mobile device? And so I think we're going to examine that question of why. Why do they do what they do? What motivates them? And what can we learn from them in this upcoming panel? And so I'm very excited to hear what our four phenomenal speakers, we have a very strong panel this afternoon, and I'm honored to be anchoring it and to be introducing these speakers. Our first speaker is Mr. John Waters. John Waters is the founder and president of iSIGHT Partners, a Dallas-based cyber intelligence firm that was recently acquired by FireEye. Prior to iSIGHT Partners, Mr. Waters was chairman and chief executive officer of iDefense, which he sold to Verizon in 2005. Over the past decade, Mr. Waters has been an active operator and investor in other innovative cybersecurity companies, including Tipping Point Technologies in 2002, Archer Technologies in 2003, and NetWitness in 2006. Prior to Mr. Waters' focus in the cybersecurity industry, he was the founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of EFO Holdings, the investment arm of Bill Esping. Mr. Waters graduated from Santa Clara University and attended the London School of Economics. Please join me in welcoming John Waters to the stage.
Working? Thank you. Well, they asked if I wanted to be the Madonna today or the podium. So I went with the Madonna. I'm not going to Vogue, you don't have to worry about that. And I actually don't even have any slides today. So, the topic here that we're talking about today is close and center to all of us, and there's been so many speakers talking about different types of threats on the horizon, the Internet of Things, operational technology, and what it might mean to us. I'm going to touch a little bit on the threat trajectories that we've seen around us, but more importantly, how do we put that in the context of risk and use that risk framework as a way to resource our companies and our governments appropriately. The days of spending countless dollars of cybersecurity funds because there's this fear, uncertainty, and doubt are quickly moving to the finish line. And people are going to have to make rational business decisions about why they invest in certain types of security programs. What is it they're trying to protect? What's the value of what they're trying to protect? And what does that value at risk mean for that organization if they don't effectively protect it? So trying to move this from a security paradigm into a risk paradigm. So if you look at the topics and just some of the trends, crime. Crime's been along as long as there's been people. And cyber crime, we all know, has now become a profound element that we have to live with as consumers. For all the hassle, even if you don't have to pay your credit card bill, when there's a false charge on it, you still have to go through the process of getting it renewed and all those things. So crime is a hassle to us as consumers, risk to organizations, and certainly risk to trust in our ecosystem. So it's gone from what was a small amount of money from a large number of customers. Think of traditional cyber crime targeting credit card processors, credit card issuers, retailers, merchants, online banks, small amounts of money from lots of consumers, to what we've seen of late is targeted attacks for large smash and grab operations, not unlike Bangladesh. Targeting now of commercial accounts rather than just individual consumer accounts, where rather than you might get a few $1,000s, there might be a few $1 million. So you've seen the stakes really rise in terms of criminal activity to try to get larger amounts of money in smaller time operations where they do all the reconnaissance work, all of the thoughts to try to understand where their holes are and their vulnerabilities and their process, and then go in for large amounts of money. So that's a real trend we've seen on the criminal side that has moved up the impact to customers rather dramatically. Then if you move into espionage. So Israel is a complete innovation hub for the world, one of the top tech centers in the world, and certainly a lifeblood of the economy here. That is not lost on the rest of the world that may be behind in terms of technology innovation, that can spend an awful lot less money on R&D if they can hijack your intellectual property and use that to replicate businesses. We've seen this in the United States for sure, and we've seen it really begin to shift around the world, including Israel. So in terms of the intellectual property and the engine of economic growth that is produced through that intellectual property, that's a real threat that you're gonna have to pay attention to as you protect your data, protect your intellectual property, and in essence, protect your economy, here and future. So if you think of terrorism, cyber terrorism today has been a lot of a concept move, but you haven't seen a lot of activity in that front in terms of what's really causing serious consequences to our industry and to our governments. But you have a convergence now that's taking place between motivation, intent, and capability. So you clearly have motivation, you have intent, and the capability today is increasingly becoming merchandised in terms of the underground market to a real capability that's expressed by what might have been a very sophisticated criminal group or a nationally affiliated entity is now able to be purchased and used by terrorist groups. What we have seen today, however, is the crossover between terrorist groups and criminal activity. And national groups and financial activity. So think of Bangladesh with a nexus back to North Korea. So you have a nation state targeting another bank in another country for financial gain. That's interesting. You also see nation states targeting commercial entities for damage, what could be called an act of terror, or certainly an act of vandalism, minimally. And then you think of what's going on in terms of terrorist organizations using traditional criminal activity as a mechanism to fund physical terrorist activity. So how am I going to fund my activity as an island that I'm on an enclave trying to fund myself for my operations where the funding lines are getting more and more challenged? If I can conduct criminal activity to harvest money from the internet, then I can turn around and use that to fund physical terrorist activity. So the threat environment we're seeing is really converging. There's a lot of confusion on the who, what, why, where, when, which really is the foundation of intelligence. So intelligence is a capability that enables decision advantage over the adversary. Who's behind it? How are they executing? And how do I understand their playbook to the extent I can detect and defeat it efficiently and effectively? So every enterprise, whether it's a commercial entity or a government, has a threat register, whether you know it or not. So in your own ecosystem of there's threat sources and threat methods targeting you in your environment, you have a threat register that presents the real risk to your organization. So there's traditional hygiene threats, noise on your network, that may not be targeted to you, just indiscriminate threats. There's threats around your enterprise. I'm a government agency in a certain country, or I'm a financial services entity, or I'm an energy sector. So you have to think of the threat register scenarios, 1 through N. So what are the actual impacts then of each of those threats? So traditional risk, threat times vulnerability times consequence. So that has been lost on the cyber industry for many years as people have focused on technology and implementing people and process to be compliant with the rules. There's a lot of talk about the threat side, but there hasn't been mapping of threat to impact and investments in security programs to mitigate and avoid that impact. So let's start putting it in a framework, and then I'll quickly move forward here. So you create a threat register, threats 1 through N that matter to your enterprise. What are the real consequences you're trying to manage with your security programs? Map it to an impact. Precision is the death of good in security. You know which threats have serious consequences and which ones do not. And then evaluate your entire program spend in light of that residual risk. So you've got threats. The impacts are going to drive how you're going to prioritize your investments. And what you're left with, investments in countermeasure programs, security programs, to reduce the probability of those threats. And you can get very precise and granular in the way you begin to lock your resourcing plans against your threat reality in a way that can continuously adapt over time as your threat reality changes over time. So to build an intelligence-led approach to security, and in fact a cyber risk management structure around security, requires understanding of your threat environment, building collection requirements and intelligence program that can deliver intelligence against that threat environment so you understand how it's changing, understand the impacts, and these are business impacts or brand impacts, they're disruptive impacts to your business, your enterprise. So what are the impacts of each of these threats? And how am I protecting myself over time as those threats change? So fundamentally, as you think about the threats today and all the presentations, people are beginning to think of what are the consequences of those threats to my organization? What are the real impacts? And then when you look at your investment program and your security initiatives, how do those map? And I would challenge you to begin building really tight mapping of the investment decisions that stand in front of you with the initiatives that you're going to fund, the threats you're trying to mitigate, and what the impacts are. And you can find simple ROI in security where you spent $1 million to avoid a $20 million problem, or you invested $100,000 to invest a $10 million problem, but don't invest $10 million to avoid a $100,000 problem. So really understand the impacts of the threats you're investing against, and I think that will go a long way towards driving precision and efficiency in your investment strategy, and create a communication system between you and the executives where they understand what you're talking about. There's been this huge security communication chasm between security organizations and executive leadership on the boards, because many of the security executives in the industry have spoken around, we blocked 40 million malware infections last month. And there's no context of what that means. Well, is that a big deal or not a big deal? Should you block 50 million, 5 million? The numbers really don't make any sense from an executive perspective. When you say we invested these dollars in this program, and the threats we were able to detect in the last month had consequences that were significantly higher than the amount we invested. So we invested $1 million in our security initiatives, and through these people, process, technology, and this intelligence, we're able to detect that threat was activated against us. We're able to detect it, defeat it, and remediate it. So we're able to avoid a $10 million issue for $1 million of investment. I'll see you next month. That's a security executive that will transition upwardly in their executive suite as a cyber risk officer. You've even seen some of the titles change from CISO to Chief Information Risk Officer. It's really a natural progression. So a lot of the turnover we've seen in the security industry, particularly among CISOs, in the US it's about 16 months as the average tenure, I think will extend materially as CISOs can begin to become business partners and line up a rational risk framework that their investments are going to purposely mitigate risk to the entity. So those are my comments as you think through the threats over the course of the week of how your investments map to those threats and how those impacts are mitigated with those investments. So thank you very much for your time.